neither the male or the female sex are either more vicious than the other or more virtuous than the other. They're both, as human beings, share rational souls, have human rational capacities. And so the most virtuous is the one who perfects those capacities.
Yeah.
I mean, all of the chapters in which she is sort of talking about virtues are expected from both men and women and are expected of all of the estates, from the prince down to the commoners. And that's important for the whole common good. And that's a very basic theme throughout.
Okay.
And so then she's able to write both in the Mere Princes tradition and the Mere Princesses for thinking about like how it is to be a lady and both the achievements of women but the responsibilities of women too. So those are the two strains you can see in her work.
Thanks for joining me today, Erika.
Thanks for having me.
So today we are here to talk about Christine de Pizan. And most people in America today have no clue who Christine is. So she was born in 1364 in the Republic of Venice. And then she's known as actually the first woman of letters in all of France. So who is this Christine de Pizan and why should we care about her today?
Yeah, she is a fascinating figure for all sorts of reasons. I think that would be interesting to your students and certainly to mine. I teach her book, The City of Ladies, in a course. She is very much a woman of medieval Christendom.
Okay.
She, though, leaves Venice when she is 3 to join her father, who has been called upon because of his own learning. He was a scholar of both astrology and medicine.
Okay. What did astrology mean?
Yeah, astrology, it's really interesting, isn't it? I think we could probably think of it as strategy in some way. It's like thinking about like the outcomes of things, like sort of projecting outcomes, both of maybe the stars, but also sort of thinking strategically about outcomes of potential natural disasters, but then other strategic types of things, and of medicine. But a very learned man who was called upon by Charles V in France to come into his court and be his court astrologer and court physician. And so he leaves his family in Venice and then his family joins him. So Christine is about 3 or 4 at this point. And what's wonderful about being under the patronage of Charles V for Christine is that with her father's great instruction, she gets to be sort of privy to Charles's giant library.
Okay.
So Charles is known as kind of one of, I think at this point, most interested monarchs in sort of learning in general. He had created a library that at his death had 1,200 books, manuscripts, etc. And so he not only collected them, he actually commissioned manuscripts and commissioned translations. So at this point, we've got Petrarch finding Cicero. We've got translations of Aristotle. We've got Augustine. We've got Seneca. I mean, she's privy to all. So
she's immersed in all this, reading this,
all of this
at a young age.
That's right. And just as he would have educated a boy, she's educated quite uniquely for a girl, both to read and write extensively in French. So she becomes a great writer, but then also some in Latin as well. So she's a very well-educated young girl, but then is married at 15.
Really? Okay.
Yes. So Thomas, her father, marries her to a university man, Etienne, who had become a court clerk. And so he is also very learned and is part of what is kind of the emerging humanist. Sort of intellectually that, we're just on the edge of the Renaissance. And so they're very interested in Latin learning. So she's very much raising her children for the time when she's married to him. After 10 years and 3 children, unfortunately, he dies. A year after her father dies.
Did he die just of
he was
illness?
Traveling and he died of an illness. Yeah.
Wow.
And what's most tragic about it really for her is not only that she was greatly in love with him, it was a beautiful marriage, but that her father had died the year before, who is of course her beloved father, but Charles V had died around the time they were married. So her father had lost his patronage, the patronage of the court, and so had become ill and feeble and poor, and around those years had turned the management of their household over to Etienne, her husband. But when he died, she had sort of nothing,
no
one. That's right. Yeah. So she now had 3 children, a niece and her mother. And what was most discouraging to her at that point is that when she went to retrieve what was due her as the widow of this man, she wasn't able to collect.
Okay.
So she had all these sort of nobles and different people who owed money, or there had been money set aside for the education of their children. She couldn't collect it. And as a widow, she thought, as a very learned woman, right, she had no way of kind of handling this. So she had to emerge. And for 6 years, she fought these kind of costly lawsuits, trying to say what was hers, demand what was hers. And so you see that theme come up a lot. Justice is a very big theme for her, and also the treatment of widows. Really importantly, before we even move too much further on, just as like a context, this is the 100-Year War. Where she is, Charles V is kind of, at some point, I don't know as much about this history, but is the kind of high point of the French monarchy. And what happens right after he dies is that his son, Charles VI, obviously takes over the monarchy and becomes mad, growing more and more mad, insane,
losing
over
his mind.
time. Losing his mind. And so during, right around the time when Christine starts to write, which we'll get to, Charles VI's son, the heir of the throne, Louis de Guienne, is sort of, there's battles over him among the dukes. Right? Because he's the one who's actually going to be in charge. And he's like 4 and 5 and becomes the heir at like 1 or something. Is married when he is 9.
Oh my goodness.
It's just this kind of insane part of the monarchy. So there's a lot of, there not only is the 100 Years War, but it's also a civil war starts to emerge because of the sort of infighting in the royal family. And what's fascinating about Christine is that she, in her writing, which we'll talk about, stays kind of above the fray. And so she earns this great respect among the aristocracy, but she is able somehow to not take sides so much, except for the monarchy itself, for the French monarchy. But in terms of the Civil War.
Was the transition from the Republic of Venice to the French monarchy, did she think much about the evolution between regimes and her thoughts on
she does. So in The Body Politic, which of course is the excerpt, she very much reveals herself to be a partial to monarchy as something that is very much established by God, and especially the French monarchy. So she sort of observes aristocracy, like there are places where, lords and nobles have, participate in government. But, as Aristotle says, monarchy is very good and aristocracy is good, but we would never want the commoners to participate. So she's very sure that if you allow too much diversity in government through allowing anyone kind of third estate to participate, there will not be peace for long. So she's very much partisan of the monarchical form of government, and is especially a lover, I think, of France. She takes her new citizenship as a young child, but then I think under the reign, especially of Charles V, she just falls in love with France. And an enormous theme of her work is sort of the security, the stability, the flourishing of the French monarchy.
So then she's writing at court then to make a living for herself.
That's right.
She's trying to stay above the fray in some respect, which I imagine is difficult because you're getting patronage from these various factions.
And she's getting patronage from both.
So what are the types of things that she starts kind of writing more immediately to kind of start making money?
So when she first starts writing to make money, she becomes just a copyist. So she had learned, so think of when she's seeing, Charles V and his manuscript production, she begins to see how important manuscript production is. And so she's doing a lot of copying at the beginning. But then she starts writing poetry. That's her first kind of literary genre. And she does that just to sort of express her grief over her husband. And she engages in in her poetry, you can see the kind of themes of her work, which I would say are very much a belief in providence. They're again, this love of the French monarchy, and the dignity of women. And you see all of these throughout through her poetry and then through the stages of her work. And the other thing to kind of mention is that you can see the way she first uses kind of standard literary device. I mean, she sort of is within the courtly love, but she's always kind of calling upon authorities. So Aristotle's quoted all the time, Cicero sometimes, Seneca, etc. She's always sort of in a humble way.
Okay.
And there's a lot of humility too. Even when we get to the Mirror of Princes tradition, she's always saying like me, as even when she has this great reputation, I am but a humble servant.
Okay.
I know very little. How I deign to give advice and instruction to those whose estate is so much higher than mine. There's a lot of humility. And at the end of all of her work, she thanks God. She asks for, that those who are reading me would pray an Our Father for my, those kinds of things. And the other thing I would say, so there's sort of authority, and then there's a lot of allegory. So allegory is a huge part of it. So very early on when she's writing poetry, say for one of them is she wants to take to task in the sort of courtly love tradition of those who are, talking about how men and women are to sort of romance one another. She wants to take to task those men who aren't living up to their chivalric duty of really like, having affection for women and treating them with respect. And she personifies Cupid in that.
Okay.
Right. So Cupid is sort of saying like, look, men, stop sort of wooing women. And then when they don't like you, insulting them. So that's sort of early on. She also has another early on where she comes in and the court of reason says, Christine, I send you to the French kings to speak to them about their obligations as rulers. So she has all these ways in which she's almost like given authority to write as a woman from these personified virtues. So like, at some point, Dame Nature comes and speaks to her. And then, of course, with the City of Ladies, we have the three ladies, the three virtues. So of justice, rectitude, reason, there's always sort of the personification of virtue throughout her work, which is really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And do you think was the reason that she was appealing to these authorities? Obviously, she studied them as a child. She was moved by them. Did she feel like, I don't know, that would strengthen her hand? Did she feel... I guess as a woman writing in this period, there weren't any. She was sort of a pioneer. Maybe there were a few. Was that just to kind of strengthen the argument?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think so. I mean, so you could think about it in terms of she is the first female professional writer to earn a living by her own pen. You could think of like a Hildegard of Bingen and other sort of great saints, scholars, etc., but they're all nuns, right? So they're being supported in that way. She's supporting herself. And so she comes under the patronage of these different dukes, Charles VI to extent that he can, his wife, and then even the King of England at some point is interested in some of her work. So she really is... she's commissioned to write the biography of Charles V, which we can talk about in some detail if you like. So there is a patronage that lasts a good 20 years. And so then she's able to write both in the sort of defense of women and then also in sort of the defense of France and the Mirror of Princes. You could say like the Mirror of Princes tradition and the Mirror of Princesses, or thinking about like how it is to be a lady and both the achievements of women, but the responsibilities of women too. So those are the two strains you can see in her work.
So before we get to those two strains, the Charles VI is going mad, kind of, as I understand it, intermittently, he's fine and then he goes crazy and then, he goes away to the countryside. And so throughout this period, his wife was ruling to some extent, managing, the royal family, the court. So was Christine's relationship primarily with the queen during these bouts of madness? Yeah,
she does. I don't know about their personal one-on-one relationship, but she does appeal to the queen at some point for peace. I mean, that's one of the striking things she does in her writing to queens is, and her writing about queens, like in terms of the education of queens or princesses or what they need in terms of for their own kind of instruction or moral instruction, is that they're always, for her, the ones who bring peace. And in some sense, she sees that as something particularly feminine, which is this sort of, there's, she'll say like, men have been the ones who have created all the atrocities and women bring peace and, can sort of sensibly talk to the king and all of that. So that's kind of her appeal, I think, to the queen, is to really ensure, especially with the Civil War, like she especially says, like this harms women so much, it harms mothers so much, like bring peace because of the way in which the blood, and the bloodshed and all that. Fascinating.
So let's start actually with her focus on women and her book, The City of Ladies, just because I think it gives maybe a bigger context for her writing on statesmanship, and also because she's slightly more famous for her book of The City of Ladies and some other books.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. So she writes that book in 1405, but it's prefaced by a debate she enters in 1402, which is really, it's the first literary, it's, querelle de femme. So it's like a literary sort of debate among intellectuals about the status of women, which continues, we might add, for like hundreds of years throughout the Renaissance, and we could say today as well. And so she enters it because there's the publication, from what I understand, that some of the people who are arguing had been colleagues of her husband. And so she kind of knows them. But one of them writes a piece in support of, or has high regard for, this very famous poem in sort of medieval times, written in the 1200s, called The Romance of the Rose. And it was written, it's 21,000 lines of poetry.
Wow. Not words.
Lines of poetry written by two different authors at two different times. And it is like an incredible literary achievement, obviously, but it's sort of it's like a seduction kind of narrative. And so, there are those who look back at this debate. I'm not one of them. I haven't researched this thoroughly, but there are those who now are apt to be partial to the opponents of Christine, because of the kind of literary way. This is like this great poem. It has great literary devices. There's a lot to be said for the poem itself. What she's upset by, and how she intervenes, is that she thinks that whatever the poem might be for scholars, it is not good for the ordinary person because of how it depicts the sexes, the relationship between the sexes, and how it depicts women. And so she's especially thinks that it's sort of foul-mouthed and holds, there's a lot about sort of catching women and the chase, and sort of treats them, she thinks, as bestial instead of human. There's a way in which it treats them as all kind of vicious. So women always are, wives are always unfaithful to their husbands. Young girls and single women are always frivolous and foolish. And so it kind of paints with a very broad brush the entire female sex. And so around this time also, I haven't read Ovid's Art of Love, but this is also being read. So there's this courtly love where women are kind of painted in broad strokes as being henpecking their husbands, all these kinds of things. So she is basically says, like, you're not holding up the Christian relationship in marriage, which should be loyalty and love and charity. And so what you're doing is, in this poem, is potentially causing one to, commit adultery, or, so she's very upset sort of with the moral status. And what it's, as a moral teaching, it's very bad. And so she enters in that way. And she has some, those who back her up, good, scholars. And so that's how I think she elevates her status right away. This is in 1402. So it's early on in her writing career.
Reading this are in court.
Yeah, that's right. So they're the only people who can read. Are aristocrats and are interested. And she keeps track of this and publishes the letters, or publishes the back and forth on her own. And I should mention, we'll get to the Mirror Princess, but at the very same years when she's commissioned to write the biography of Charles V. So we'll hold off on that. But so these are kind of happening in tandem. So then in 1405, she re-engages this very same question. And so she writes, and this is the most well-known piece of writing. This is the piece of writing that I teach, which is the book of The City of Ladies. And so let me tell you about that book, which is followed by, a year after, in 1406, The Treasury of Ladies. And so the way I would think about it is that the book of The City of Ladies is really about sort of the capacities of women and the achievements of women throughout history. And then The Treasury, which is much less read, we can sort of guess why, is about the responsibilities of women in sort of the different estates. So that's the Mirror Princesses, and then landowners and commoners. So so to set the stage of the City of Ladies, Christine, and the other part of her work that's fascinating, why we know so much about her as a woman in the 1400s, is because she writes in an autobiographical vein. So, for instance, just to back up one more time. One of her big poems, it's like The Long Road of Learning. She tells sort of her whole, and then she has a vision, autobiographical vision. In all of these places, she tells kind of stories about herself, as I mentioned, saying like, keep writing to defend the French and keep writing to defend women. I mean, they kind of come in. And I think you're right to say, as you said before, that in some ways these are used to sort of say there's other authorities, higher authorities that are sort of giving me the authority as this woman to write. Yeah. And I think that's right. And even in some places you'll see her. So in the City of Ladies, when these three ladies come to her, they tell her it's God who has sent us. Okay. She kind of has this annunciation moment where she says, okay, be it done according to thy word, kind of thing. So she's like using the authority of Mary there and the authority of God to sort of bolster her own writing. So she's sitting in this work. She herself, Christine, is sitting in a study, and she is reading Lamentations of Malthesis, I think is how you say, or Malthesis. I can't remember exactly how you say his name, but it's in this same tradition of romance. So the Rose of Ovid's Art of Love, where this one is a lament by a man who's obviously been really hurt in marriage. So it's like an anti-marriage, anti-woman tract. In which it's basically like the female sex is like marred in viciousness and vice and sin. And so she is reading this and she's sort of like, gosh, so this man says this, and then Aristotle, depraved, or, females are, deficient males, and the blaming of Eve for sin, and like all of this. And she's sitting there ruminating on this and saying, gosh, but how could this be? Because God created both of us. How could God have done, like, sort of created such a horrible creature? And she kind of laments and says, I wish I hadn't if a woman is this bad, even though I know what great women, and how could I wish I hadn't been created a woman. And so these three ladies appear in her study. And so this is Lady Reason and Lady Rectitude and Lady Justice. And they appear to her and say, oh no, Christine, you've got this all wrong. And God has sent us to you because he wants you to create a book which is basically like a city of ladies to first sweep out kind of the untruths. So take the debris away and then build a foundation of truths and then populate the city. And so those are the three parts of the book. And then
is the character of Christine de Pizan in the book, is this similar to like in Thomas More's Utopia? There's a character named Thomas More. Are all of her views embodied by the character, or is the Christine the character different?
That's interesting. No, so the role she plays as the character is the devil's advocate. So what she is always asking, every time she comes up out of sort of the narrative of one of these ladies, it's for her to say, but I hear what you're saying, but these men are saying this.
Got it. Okay.
Right? And so she plays devil's advocate and puts out all the arguments that have come across. So that's, and sort of like, okay, I guess you're sort of starting to convince me, but what do you think about this? And so those are the ways that she comes up through these three parts. And when you read scholars of Christine, especially say feminist scholars who are interested in this book, they tend to sort of place it as she is doing the first writing of women into history. Like women have always existed in history. We don't hear about them. Here she is in the first section talking about pagan, Jewish, and mythological women. She's talking about women who have great intelligence, creativity, queens, but also, again, mythological figures. And so here they are, and she's talking about their kind of nobility and strength, and that like there's one line of like an intelligent woman is capable of anything. And so that's great. And there's a lot to be said for all that. And most of the book is these stories. But the reason I teach it is because it also, at the very beginning of the text, before you enter into all of these different women, it gives you a sense of Christine's worldview, and especially her medieval worldview, and what she thinks of justice, rectitude, and reason. And so that, I think, is particularly interesting. And the way I teach it is right after Thomas Aquinas. Because I think it gives us a sense of, at least I pull out of it and tease out sort of a sense of the medieval view of law, medieval view of justice. A very high account of reason as a participation in God's reason. So justice, I mean, again, we always hear of justice wanting to give each his due. And so that part of it, I think, is really fascinating. It's just a very short bit of it, but I think is like very much worth reading. So what are some kind of things to say about that? I mean, one of the main themes that comes out in both the intervention and the Quarrel des Femmes about the Romance of the Rose, and then also in the City of Ladies, is her views about virtue, which we'll see a great deal of in Mirror Princes. But that for her, virtue is, it's neither the male or the female sex have sort of, are either more vicious than the other or more virtuous than the other. They're both, as human beings, share rational souls, have human rational capacities. And so the most virtuous is the one who perfects those capacities.
Yeah.
And so there are very much, so the virtues are expected from both men and women, all the virtues, and are expected of all of the estates, from the prince down to the commoners. And that's important for the whole common good. And that's a very basic theme throughout. And so there's an equality there. Yeah. But there's also different, just like we'll see with the different, estates and the different roles in society. We also see this with regard to men and women, because there's sort of, as she says, nobles must be nobles. They must act like nobles, right? And so there are ways in which kind of the duties, the tasks, the behavior, the conduct is different. Yeah. And she kind of says, like, God gives them their nature for their particular conduct. Sure. And so, but at the same time, women are very much expected to be as rational as men. And what does she mean by rational? Again, it's sort of right reason, participating in God's reason, and as we, summoning toward the good, summoning away from evil. And that's how she understands virtue, as kind of the qualities that allow one to live according to the good and away from evil. So it's like a basic medieval worldview in this kind of beautiful text.
Yeah. It sounds like it. So who are some of the women that stand out, either the historical ones or the mythological ones in her story?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the whole section on, so there are many queens at the beginning she refers to. She also refers to kind of those who run and govern households, and how capable they are of doing so in their husband's absence, and those kinds of things. The way in which their intelligence, like one of the questions she poses as a devil's advocate to, I'm not sure which one it is, I think it's probably Lady Reason at this point, is, but aren't women bad in judgment? They're not. So the kinds of things she comes at, women don't have good judgment. They aren't discreet with their husbands. They're unchaste. Like, these are the kinds of things. They aren't affectionate toward their husbands. And so she's trying to prove, like, yeah, there could be some women like that. In fact, there are some women like that. But look at all these other women. So she's trying to like weigh all these other women. And, some would say that by the way she tells the story, she kind of leaves out some details so that you're never hearing about like the bad parts of women. But she, so one I think was particularly interesting to me, as she tells the story about the Sabine women who save. So it's what the Romans, and I'm not sure which part of Roman history this is, but the Romans are able to, they have a war with the Sabines, or a battle with the Sabines, by sneaking up, and they steal the daughters over to their own, and they marry them. Well, they rape them and they marry them, and they become then the daughters. These Sabine women have children. And so then one of the Sabine women comes and there's a civil war that endures, and all sorts of people are dying. And it's, of course, the Sabine women's fathers on the one side, and their husbands, and potentially their sons. And so the Sabine women are very like, we've got to do something about this. We've got to stop it. And so they kind of run into the battle, and they say, stop, all of you, because you're killing our husbands and you're killing our fathers, and please halt. And they stop, and then they become friends. So it's sort of like an image of peace. I'm trying to think of others who would be particularly interesting. None are particularly coming to mind as those.
What about in any Old Testament women?
Yes. So yes. So you've got, yes, absolutely. So you've got Judith, their stories. So the whole third part, when you've got Lady Justice who's populating, she starts with Mary, and then she brings in all the different saints. So you've got right away the early, St. Catherine, I think, is one of the first. And so that third section is the one that's sort of least looked at, because it's sort of familiar to us in terms of it being like stories of the female saints.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Okay. So then moving on to her Mirrors for Princes. So what prompts her to kind of shift from writing about women to advising rulers?
Yeah. So she is very concerned with the state of the monarchy under Charles VI, and then with the future sovereign in mind, because here he is at 4, 5, 6. She's now able to write, and she has in her mind's eye, of course, the Platonic form of the king, which is Charles V. For her, I think as a young child, as part of his court, but then she talks about his nobility of heart being the only thing that gives worldly renown. She talks about him having every single virtue and never, lacking in virtue. I mean, she really has a lot to say. And in her biography, she certainly holds him up. She compares him to sort of ancient rulers. She talks about him and his great love of wisdom and knowledge. In that biography, she mentions, so this is 1402, before the Body Politic book. She mentions that his love of knowledge goes so far as to the outer limits of knowledge, which is theology. And she says that, theology is this, is true knowledge because it's kind of knowledge of God's great virtues through reason and learning. And so there's just like this real affection for this particular monarch. Okay. And so she's now seeing what's happening and she's very worried, especially about the stability of the French monarchy. Because remember, from her perspective, and we'll certainly get to this, there's no sort of checks and balances on the monarch. Yeah. The only check and balance there is the monarch's own virtue in some sense, right? And so she's interested in and again, she's been told by court reason back when in one of her poems that she has this obligation to instruct the French prince in both moral instruction, but then also military instruction, which is really fascinating, which she does in about 1409 in a book called, I think it's called Deeds of Arms and Chivalry. Okay. Sort of just war sort of thing. We could talk about that if you like. But anyway, so she begins writing in order to really kind of salvage or give some, there's like the possibility that this young heir could go the right way if he's given the right instruction, right? And so early on in her book of the Body Politic, she explains first this analogy she's using, which I think is obviously very important. She says she borrows it from Plutarch. Okay. So the image of the polity as a body. And she says, of course, there's great harmony in the body. There's interdependence in the body, and that there needs to be health in all parts of the body. Okay. Because if there's not health, which she sort of reads synonymously as virtue, then it's all going to be disorder. Yeah. And so she, as you can imagine, the prince is the head of the body, who, as our reason directs our limbs to act, the prince directs the laws, which have the other estates act. And so the prince she then spends a lot of time about his instruction and what he must do. And then there's this part 2 and part 3. Part 2 is about knights, so we could talk about that, and part 3 is about commoners, and all of those are really interesting. Yeah. And I'm not sure with regard to the other male princes how much they spend with the other parts, because for her, the arms and the hands are the nobles and the knights who provide stability and protection to the realm. And then the commoners are the belly and the feet and the legs. Yeah. They provide nourishment and comfort and all of that. So she actually, at the very, very end, I'll just give us a foreshadowing. The very, very end of the book, she's talking about the agricultural workers, who are kind of the lowest of the low, the commoners. And she says they're the most necessary of all because they provide nourishment to the body. And so she really has this kind of affection for all the different, and she wants the prince to have affection for all of them too. So at the very beginning, the prince is, she says, well, of course, Aristotle tells us that if we're going to have a healthy polity that is governed well and ordered well, there must be an ordering of the person, and that's virtue. And so the prince must be first. She kind of toggles between Aristotle and Christianity. It's a good medieval thinker. Yeah. But so the prince must first have a love of God. Okay. And she really, throughout the book, is very intent that he is ordained by God to rule. He must be like a good shepherd with his people. But he is a mere mortal, and he will, really be judged on what he does in his life. Yeah. And so as he's given this great power, he has, it's really, she's kind of, I think it's trying to instill some fear. Yeah. Yeah. Concern. Because as you said, with the checks and balances, right? If you don't have formal checks,
the conscience and the fear of the judgment seat of Christ. Those are the
That's
main
it.
checks. Yeah.
And as we'll talk about Charles V, how she saw that, that he was very humbled by that. She's not so sure about, forget Charles VI, who, as we know, but with Louis, she's, I think, quite concerned as she's starting to see, he's beginning to have a reputation as she's writing in this time for really liking the luxury of being a prince.
Yeah.
So love of God, and she even includes mass. She includes the hours, but she said don't spend too much time lengthy prayers, but just pay attention.
Good deeds.
Good deeds.
Kind of
it's really good deeds.
Yeah.
But the tutor is very important.
Okay.
And so the tutor for a prince, and it's interesting if we look at the mere princesses as how because the tutor is very important for both.
Sure.
But how she thinks about it is that the prince needs to be taken away from his mother quite soon.
Okay.
And taught by the tutor chivalry.
Okay.
And a great sort of love of honor and glory.
Okay.
And that those for Christine are very important and good and true. There's she does say, I realize that, in the spiritual life, you have to be careful, but as long as one is doing sort of moral work and it's a just cause, one should have honor. And Aristotle says so.
Yeah.
So again, is this toggling.
Yeah. So maybe I want to zoom in on this because I thought this was just fascinating reading her in comparison to some of the other, particularly Christian mirrors, that you might pull from, let's say, chapters of Augustine's City of God, Thomas Aquinas on kingship, then even Erasmus, The Education of a Christian Prince. Because what's funny when you read those books, I don't know if it's funny, what's interesting is that, there's not a lot of love shown for earthly glory in any form, especially Augustine. You're happy now by extension, by hope in your future, the kingdom of God, right? And Thomas Aquinas talks about, there's nothing earthly which is a fitting reward for a king. It's all in the future. And then Erasmus says, he says, there's a lot of good you can mine from Cicero, but those sort of pagan histories, you might want to stay away from those. Or if you read them with caution and sort of pull, a little piece of gold like it's from a dung heap, you know?
Yeah.
And so what strikes me, I think there's a sense of realism in her writing, so it's basically even when she's kind of giving advice to the prince and she's saying, she has, different sort of virtues that she's listing, and she'll list the virtue and she'll basically start and say, you should do this because of God, because that's what it means to be a good Christian. And then she pauses for a brief second. And then she's also but you also need to be popular if you're going to be a king and maintain your kingdom, and honor is pretty important too, because you want to be, widely respected. And then let me go and give you this story from kind of antiquity about how this conquering Roman showed mercy. And so do you want to be the cool, the Romans? And then it's all of a sudden you see how, in one sense, it's youmaybe she knows the mind of men very well. And it's we have to, we'll start with piety because that's the ultimate thing. But, really, you're going to be successful in the earthly realm if you do these things too, you know?
It is true. And I think that's why it shows her to be both medieval and then Renaissance. She's just on the cusp of the Renaissance. And I think that's where you see that a lot of the virtues are sort of articulated as Christian virtues. And then she does use these ancient Roman examples, like Hector of Troy is an example where she says he was mighty and fierce in battle. Killing his enemies. But then when they surrendered, he treated them as brothers. But that's and the way in which, as a prince with the power that the prince has, he can resemble most God in his liberality, in his humanity, in his clemency and mercy, because he has this power.
Do you want to be like God? Yes, want to be a God-like king?
And she does. There are times when she does, again, it's like a toggling where she does say, I realize spiritually that you have to be careful of these things, but there can be honor for just deserts. Because if you're acting morally, and you have a just cause. And that's why it's interesting, because she does have this piece on this book on, acts of or deeds of arms and chivalry, and the way in which she takes like arms very seriously and writes this military. I mean, it was such an extensive military instruction that it was translated into different languages, but they kept her name off as a woman.
Yeah. Okay.
Because it was kind of so impressive that they thought a woman could know about this.
And did she learn that purely from book study, or was she practically out there?
I mean, I think learned from book study. Being, who knows what her father and husband, all of that. But so that's, I think, particularly interesting. And in that text, I thought this was wonderful. She has this sense of what just war is. And she says a just war, there can be war, and warfare is a good if it's humane and just. And what does that mean? Well, just is an account that when war is done for rational reasons, and unjust is when it's done on the basis of will, kind of arbitrary will. Again, a very medieval framing. And so what are some of the just reasons? I mean, she has 3 and then 2 unjust reasons. So the first just reason is if it's for, justice and lawfulness. And the very first thing she lists is protecting the church.
Okay. Yeah. There we go. Yeah.
And then the second one is, making sure evildoers don't do thus and so. And then the third is taking back lands.
Okay.
But then she says the 2 unjust reasons. One is empire. So it's like going and trying to acquire Christian lands.
Okay.
So I'm not sure if she's okay with acquiring unchristian non-Christian lands. But there is, just like with Aristotle, there is a sense that the monarch has to be called to this high level of virtue, because he really is, we're like trusting in providence that he'll be healthy for the regime. But then there's very strong, like, hell awaits you kind of language for the prince who has, takes part in like kind of avarice. The worst possible thing is cruelty, who has any self-interest. So self-interest for her is just so poisonous to the body politic, to the common good, whether it takes place at the highest level or at the lowest level for those who badmouth the prince. Right. And so together we're working for the common good. I mean, it's like this very, again, medieval harmony. Good. All the body parts are working together. If this would just work, it'll be fine. Of course, she at the end of her life has to leave Paris, and because there's so much infighting, she loses a lot of hope at that point, and she starts to only write about like the passion of Christ, and the providence of Christ, until Joan of Arc. And then she begins to.
So before we get to Joan, this is so many thoughts are coming into my mind right now. We had a lecture earlier where we were talking about the difference between Eusebius and Augustine. And Augustine's obviously a more towering theologian, but Eusebius was contemporary of Constantine, and basically his vision of the state, which was much more optimistic. It was his understanding of human of original sin was more based off of origin. And so there was more optimism that you could just baptize this state. But for him, though, it's funny because it's the historical circumstances are so important, because for him, he went from persecution under Diocletian to, miracle of miracles, the Roman emperor is now a Christian. And like all of a sudden the hope of what the kingdom of heaven transforming the earth is real, whereas you go over to Augustine and he sees, the sack of Rome and North Africa and all these Vandals and all these different things. And there's a pessimism that is shaping the theology. And he's also more inspired by Tertullian. But it's just so interesting how your whole views of politics and what's possible and changes if things are going well versus poorly. Before we get to Joan of Arc, and even I think we could talk a little bit more about the common good and her understanding of that. For her advice to princesses, is she similarly evoking, honor and chivalry and great Romans, or is she like leaving that out and appealing to other things?
Yeah, no, I would say she is appealing to other things. So there is a way in which she still wants piety in the princess, and she still wants learning in the princess. But the way in which you see sort of the gentleness and the fear with the prince, you need to sort of instill fear, but you also need to be gentle. With the princess, there's not a lot of fear. There's being strict, but there's be playful. And so you don't want to kind of drive her away. And with both, there's a sense of whatever you do, sort of, the tutor shouldn't be showing any type of kind of foolish things, because there's a second nature that gets formed by any type of like sort of observation of virtue in stories, observation of vice in these stories. So I would just say there's she doesn't talk about the love of arms for the princesses.
Sure. Okay.
But there is a sense of, like a, the way of kind of peace and wanting to instill those kinds of sentiments.
Okay.
And I think compassion for the poor. But again, that's also for the prince too. One of the things she says is for the prince is like the clerics have to come and teach him about theology. And he also needs to have those who tell him about how the poor live. Like, how do they make their ends meet so that he can have compassion and understanding for the poor.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fascinating. So the common good. So I'm curious, a couple things. So, for Cicero, the common good has to do with the flourishing of the whole body politic. The leader, the prince, the senator, whoever, shouldn't be putting their own self-interest, their own class interest, their own partisan interest above the whole. So she's obviously, familiar with Cicero, but then talk about kind of the relationship between the three different parts in France at that time.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that's where you can see, again, exactly the same in these different, so the Treasury of Ladies, as you see that with the princesses and sort of, and then the nobles and the sort of households, and then the kind of wives, mothers, etc. Just sort of the most equal class in some sense with men and women. They're all sort of just trying to make ends meet, right? We'll talk about that. But so with the men, in this sense, the knights and the nobles who are out there, having to defend and be prepared to defend. What's interesting is how she talks about, I thought a lot about this with my three sons, how she talks about preparation for knighthood is that they have to, again, be taken from their mothers quite early and be really raised by, not so much raised by their fathers, but their fathers have to take them and do challenging feats all the time. They have to sleep on hard floors. They can't have nice, like kind of good food. Like any type of decadence is not for knights. So they have to, they can't have any sort of arrogance. So like you think about entitlement, like none of that. They have to really be, and given a kind of this love for arms soon. So she has, I think, 6. Let's see if I can remember the kind of 6 qualities. Again, the virtues are all the same throughout all the classes, both the sexes, but the qualities are kind of different that she wants to bring up for that particular kind of state or station in life. So it's love of arms is the first one. Amazingly, it's like this kind of chivalry, like the love and the glory. That's another one of the 6 is like glory and honor should be first among all. I don't know. I don't think I'm remembering one of these 6 as piety at all. Or the knights. Interesting. I don't remember piety. Courage is of course one. Loyalty and truth telling is another. Cunning in battle. I'm trying to think if I have all the 6. Maybe I have 5. But anyway, so the knights and the noblemen, or the knights, that stage, it's there is a sense of really being kind of prepared and hardened for battle. And then given a sense of sort of instruction in what it is to do battle well. I mean, she really takes that very seriously, and sort of the strategy of battle and all that. And then we come to the third, so the common or the third estate. So she then divides this into 3, and she talks about the clergy. And she sort of brings the clergy together with the learned, and so sort of the professors sort of class, I guess you'd say. And she says only great things about them in terms of their love of wisdom, their love of learning. She sort of says like, this is the greatest. I mean, I think if she were to put herself somewhere, maybe that's where she would understand herself, as sort of the love of wisdom and the care about and the concern of learning and teaching and all that. And then she talks about the merchants, and each of these, they're the shortest parts of the book, but she really has such a, for us as a commercial republic in some sense, she really has good insight about what merchants need to do. I mean, one of the things she says is, thank God that they figured out how to kind of trade with one another so that we wouldn't all be kind of doing the same thing again, right? So we could be, engaging in other types of knowledge and all that. And then she says, in terms of the merchant, they must be honest. It's the most important of their traits. And if they ever are committing fraud against their people, they shouldn't even be called merchants. They should be basically called like thieves.
Okay.
And again, it's sort of like a low place in hell for them, kind of thing. And then she comes across, then she tells about the agricultural, and she really just, wants to sort of commend like that, she sort of says like they're ill treated, they're not respected, but like they're the most important of everyone in the body because they nourish us and we wouldn't go another day, very long without them. And so there is kind of, even though there is such a hierarchy and such an ordering of classes, there's like this great affection that she is able to articulate, and that the prince from the top needs to have affection, and that the bottom has to have affection for the prince too. And it's their responsibilities and their duties as part of this,
And is that from her own personal experience she develops that, or is it still mostly reading and she's learned that that's what it means?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no question that her experience as a widow and the kind of suffering she endured as someone who like had to kind of creep out her own living it's got to be super important there. And then you see that on the other side with the women as well. I don't know if there's anything you want to say about the body politic before we move to the women.
Yeah. So I guess the last thing from the book of the body politic is she concludes with this advice that the prince needs to be feared. And she says the way that he's feared is by maintaining justice, by punishing evildoers. But this component, she even gives some examples from the Romans about there was one Roman leader who basically the soldiers would never desert him because they feared desertion more than their own life, right? So this sense of being feared was really striking, in some ways almost like foreshadowing Machiavelli. And she gives this image of the lady lordship going back to kind of classical antiquity. And in her hands, she has basically a symbol of peace, but then there's also a sword in the other hand. And these two things go together. So I'm wondering, your thoughts on kind of this emphasis, again, on arms, but on also a healthy degree of sort of a holy fear that you need to cultivate.
Yeah. And I think it goes right along. So we have a hard time thinking about this, I think, as, today as moderns, but for her, it was very basic that, of course, the prince had to be feared. Of course, he has to install justice. Of course, justice has to be important in order that he may be liberal, in order that he may be humane, in order that he may be, exercise clemency, because those have to be sort of graces given.
Okay.
So like and I mean, it feels like a sort of medieval rendering of how God would act, right? It's like God is powerful, God is just, and then he bestows these graces of forgiveness and clemency and all that. And so to be like a God, you must, because of the power you have, you must therefore, so that people, I mean, again, like, is it Hector when she says like he treats so humanely those who have surrendered as brothers, and it's like that kind of, because they fear him and then he treats with such humanity, they wanted to come. She says the Romans gained more occupation, more lordship, more by surrendering, because people wanted that kind of freedom to live with these people who treated them so humanely. And so I think that that's kind of the way in which she brings those two together, is like, again, but then she says there are these others who don't have that kind of humanity, and they race in like rabid dogs, I think, or starving dogs, and they just rape the women and they pillage and all of this, and they will be, I mean, that is, she says, it's against divine law, it's against nature, and they will be basically punished in hell. Yeah. So there is like this real sense, and I think her hope is that the prince has this strong sense. And again, she has Charles V as an example of someone who did have that strong sense and that strong responsibility to not act against sort of divine law and nature and all that.
And do we know that Charles VI and his tutors, do we know that they were reading this? Or was it just like the hope is that they read it, and take it to heart?
Yeah, I mean, that's what's interesting, is the fact that she was commissioned, and the fact that she, to write the biography of Charles V, and then is under the patronage. So the person who the Duke of Burgundy is the one who commissions her to write his brother's biography, and her son, Christine's son, has a place in his household. So there is some sense that at least someone was reading in order to, what they were able to do to actually educate the heir, the future sovereign Louis. I don't know that they did very well. It didn't seem as though that was the case. But I think one of the scholars I was reading was just talking about how, in some sense, she failed for the prince before her. But I mean, the way in which you read her now, it's like this great kind of narration of the glory of the French monarchy, despite the particular representatives of it. So it kind of lives institutional. Yes, it lives as this kind of something, a statement for how one could believe so firmly in the French monarchy, especially as a devout Catholic who understands it as ordered by God, as something, and their kind of responsibility that the monarch had for,
Interesting. So then, are there any more insights from the book for princesses that you think are worth noting?
Yeah. So I mean, I think the state of, this sort of takes us entirely into the more, the common class, and the nobles, I think, is we have such an understanding that, there's always this kind of progression for women. It was like really bad in medieval times for women. And I don't think you would get that from reading her or from reading other sort of accounts of what it is for medieval women. There's a way in which Christianity brings about an understanding of, obviously, both are in the image of God. So she's, there's churchmen who are saying these things too. It's not only Christine. What's interesting is that there's like this interesting tension, because you've got her appealing to Aristotle for the kind of in the politics and the ethics, his teachings on virtue, but then also sort of discounting him and want to argue against his direct teachings on women, as in the same way, she's looking at the way in which Mary is the virgin is very much, sort of hailed as the best possible woman, and therefore women's status is raised. But then Eve is, there's commentators at this time who really depict Eve as the cause of the fall, as like the sole cause of the fall. And that's how a lot of this is wrapped up in sort of the real castigating of women as so vicious, right? And so that's what's happening in terms of like the literature and the thinking about. But when you dig deeper, even like someone like Tertullian, who is very much, you can find all sorts of quotes that are pretty awful about women, but then you can also find really lovely quotes about him. So, and same way, like there's all sorts of different medieval thinkers you can look at, and older Christian thinkers you can look at. Augustine, who sees both this sort of the spiritual equality in both. So it's a complex sort of, in terms of like the thinking that's going on, the theory, the theology. I would say it's highly complex. What's not complex and what and she's very much sees is the way in which women are regarded because of the work that they do. And so take the kind of the lowest classes, right, where women are very much part of the household, which are engaged in often learning their husband's trade just as much as the husband is, like along as both an apprentice, but then someone who can, when he goes off, she can kind of instruct his workers. Even, what are known as femme souls, those single women are, learning trades themselves. So women who are like equally part of the economy in some sense. And so there's a lot of equal regard there because they're taking part in the economy. Then look, a class up at the lords and ladies who have these great households, and women are very much the ones who are governing the households. And so she kind of is, she talks about the way the kind of virtues necessary for that governance. Because of, I think, what she didn't know, it's almost like she was given this intellectual training and education, but not sort of training about law and the kinds of things she would have needed as a widow to deal with these lawsuits. So she sort of says, like, it's really important that women who run households need to have a sense about feudal law, about trusts, about all these kinds of things, in order that if their husband is away, that they can manage the property. So it's a bit more of a complex terrain, I think, than we're used to sort of thinking as like, all that was bad, those evil things, but she is also adding to the Christian advance in some sense, because she's sort of pointing out, Eve, it wasn't only Eve, it was Adam too. And also, did you notice that Eve, and this is something that she got from others who had said before her, and then others repeated after, but Eve was created out of man's rib, from his side, not to be his servant, but to be his companion. So there's all those kinds of corrections that she's making, but it's not as though she's the only one who's saying these things, right? But it's just the onslaught of voices is and poetry in these courtly poems. It feels as though there's a lot of sort of animus toward women, but I think you can find kind of both. And if you look around, you can see lots of women who are doing great work and are very much respected as having great capacity.
I'm curious, in your own, point of view with, sort of women in statecraft. And I guess if you go back, you think of Judith, or you think of other maybe female emperors from throughout history. Are there any, what do you think are the unique kind of contributions of women to politics? Is it peace? I'm sure peace might be part of it. Are there other things that you think, women really leaned into these virtues and that made them successful or set them apart from some of the other male thinkers?
It's interesting. She was read and by these great women after her. I think it's Margaret Navarre and others read her. I mean, there's sort of a list that I can't come up with of great leaders who would read her and be influenced by her. So, is peace and sort of those more liberal virtues that she commends to the men, to commends to the prince, do those come more naturally for women leaders? Maybe. I mean, I think obviously we could think of like a Margaret Thatcher, and maybe those wouldn't be the first that you would think of her. There's an interesting, I mean, this isn't so much on statesmanship, but it's this interesting thing that how she thinks about the kind of distinctive qualities of men and women. And you could really do a sort of scholarly sample of like, how does she think of the prince's education? How does she think about the princess's education? That would reveal a lot, I think. But there's a one early piece of work where it's called the misfortune. Is it? Now I'm forgetting the exact name. The Tales of Misfortune or something, where fortune comes to her, and she sort of is talking about like the arbitrariness of fortune compared to like providence and those kinds of things. And she says that when fortune got her, she was married and then she was shipwrecked and her husband died. That's not actually how her husband died, but in the story, her husband dies, and fortune makes her a man.
Okay.
And it's this really interesting thing. And she goes on to say, as like, she is put in the circumstance of having to be a man, and she is pushed to have kind of more like courage in the state that she's in now as a widow. So it's kind of an interesting thing where she is reckoned that she's now moved from being a woman in a place to having the role of a man. So you wonder, like, does that mean she thinks that, it's men who have courage? But then it's very clear in her other work on women that she really sees both women and men as like requiring all these virtues. So it's, and like capable of living them out, depending on their capacity. So I'm not sure. It seems like peace is something that she would say. I'm not I don't know enough about sort of different queens throughout history to say what they would bring. That's my sense.
Sure.
It's sort of a sense of, I mean, if you would look at her compared to others, say in your book, you'd have to tell me, but it seems like is there more of an affection for those lower classes? Is there more affection for the poor?
Yeah.
And just seeing that the princess really needs to be focused there.
Yeah, that's interesting. So if you think of, a couple other things that come to mind. So if you think of Theodora, right, who in a real sense was sort of a co-ruler with Emperor Justinian, right, in the Roman Empire as they understood it, we would have maybe called the Byzantine Empire. There was a way in which she really did help to she kind of took up the cause of prostitutes, particularly former prostitutes, helping have them have sort of an on-ramp back to being able to marry, and not, basically have their life be ruined if they found a way out of that profession. So she was certainly always kind of urging Justinian to take care of the poor. She was also, though, another thing that I've picked up on, it could be an overgeneralization, but it does seem to me like some sort of a lot of these great female leaders or advisors, they're incredibly cunning, you know, and if they might not have sort of the force of an entire army behind them, so they make up for it with their cunning and their, you know, and you see this. I mean, Theodora could also be, you know, quite ruthless. She, at one point, you know, Justinian wanted to flee Constantinople during the Nika riots, and she basically said, you know, it's better to, I would rather die than flee and give up the royal purple. And so she said, you know, basically, no, lead them all into the hippodrome and kill 30,000 people, you know. And this was the advice that Theodora gave. And she was just totally, and I was talking about this in one of the other interviews, and there's an aspect to that is that the church, you know, regards as you know, quite sinful in that action, you know, but she kind of, she offered that advice to like save the empire, right? Or if you look at Judith, you know, her solution to the Assyrians is, well, kind of slip behind enemy lines, you know, essentially seduce the general, get him drunk, and then not lose my virtue, though. You know, be very strict about that, but then I'm going to cut his head off and bring it back.
And she does tell the story. And
it's a remarkable story.
And it's told without any, I mean, it's like, she's the hero.
She's the hero. This is, you know, she's celebrated. And, but also like there's a humility and all the glory is given to God. And, but there's also this bold action and this cunning. So I don't know, those are some of the other themes that I picked up. Maybe to kind of close this section, there's a pretty powerful image from the book, her biography of Charles V, of sort of two crowns that he calls to him at the end of his life. Yeah, it's really quite stunning. I was really moved by this, where he has gathered kind of all his people around him, and he asks for the crown of thorns to be brought to him from the Bishop of Paris, and then the coronation crown to be brought. And he puts the crown of thorns upon his head, and then he puts the coronation crown at his feet. And I think I've sent you the prayers that maybe you would want to read ahead of that. Just a story that kind of foreshadows that, right, that comes directly before it in the book is a knight asks Charles V, you know, it must be so wonderful to be the king, I mean, with all this power. And he says, oh, it's much more burden than glory. The most pleasure I have in being the king is the power to do good. And that is very much, I think, in these prayers. Yeah, definitely. Which are quite, I think if there's something to be said for why she had such high regard for the French monarchy, it would be in sort of the content of these prayers. Yeah, definitely. And so the first prayer, you know, he's basically talking about sort of the sweetness of, you know, of the crown of thorns and the sort of the hope of, you know, eternal life offered by it. And so that I found very moving and very beautiful. But the second one, sort of his prayer about the coronation crown is absolutely haunting. I'll actually read that line. He says, "O crown, how inestimable you are, and inestimably how very vile. Inestimable, considering the mystery of justice that you enclose within you, and that you carry with such force, but vile and vilest of all things, considering the labors, deeds, anguishes, torments, and pains of heart and body, conscience, and the perils of soul that you give to those who wear you on their shoulders. And he who might truly see these things would rather leave you lying in the mud than lift you to be placed upon his head." Right. And he left that coronation crown lying in the mud right there for all of his people to see. It's quite astonishing. Unbelievable. Yeah. And so then that kind of, you know, in one sense, it's sort of, what are we doing talking about statesmanship? You know, we're giving, but it is also for all the burden and the peril that it could even put your soul into, you know, thinking back to the, you know, I guess that example of Theodora and Justinian, you know, eventually they were considered to be saints, at least in the Eastern Church. But clearly there are these situations that demand, you know, they're very tough situations, and oftentimes they fall into grave sin, and you know, through repentance, perhaps they're saved. In other cases, you know, maybe not. So I guess as we think about the art of statesmanship today, you know, reflecting on this tradition, and also given the context where, you know, in a commercial republic, democratic republic, are there lessons from Christine de Pizan about the common good, about women, right, in politics? how do you see it as being relevant in our own day?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very clear to me that in some sense, just as she's sort of really asking, just, quoting Aristotle all the time, that self-government requires some sense of self-government, that, that is really what's incumbent upon us. I mean, it's really like how our founders understood the Republic, is that we're all sort of a prince. We're all, or at least an aristocrat, like we're all ruling and being ruled in turn. And so there's a way in which we need to, I mean, all of the chapters in which she is sort of talking about the virtues could be read by all of us, and we could all improve
in each
a great deal in each of those, including even in terms of, the way in which, justice and fear work together with liberality and humanity. I mean, every time we have a position of power, that we must act justly, but we also then have the capacity to act with like the noblesse oblige in some sense in that position we have, whether it's as a parent or as a boss or as whatever it is, a governor, a president. So I think all of those in terms of statesmanship are very, very important. Potentially more important, right? I mean, in terms of the order of the whole, and thinking about the body politic as a body in which each one of us is participating. Maybe we now have the freedom to think of ourselves in the different places. Obviously, I am not the head of the country, neither are you, but you are a head of an organization. And so the way in which you think about the different tasks of and sort of the norms of each of those, I think is important for us, because sometimes we're so flattened and egalitarian that we sort of think like all we need is virtue and we don't need any different distinctive duties or distinctive ways of being. I think those are really interesting insights. I think her work on women is very, very important. When I was, I don't read a lot of the sort of anti-woman sort of vitriol that's online. But I think those could certainly, those who are pushing that out, or even anti-man. I mean, any of it for her, it's like these two coming together. It's like one is not more vicious than the other. It's, it's human to be prone to sin, she says, and to be prone to vice, but it's also human to have the capacity to live according to reason and according to, and to live virtuously and live according to the good. And so, she would want each man and woman, as she says, the best is the one who lives perfects his or her capacities. So like, let's each reach out for our best. And that also in marriage, I mean, to see the beauty she had in her own marriage. And so throughout her work, there's always just a real elevation of the goods of marriage, of the harmony, of the loyalty. I mean, there's a whole section in which she, in the City of Ladies, one of the pieces of Devil's Advocate, she says, it seems as though women aren't affectionate to their husbands or aren't loyal or aren't discreet. All of those ways in which she then wants to commend these virtues to women, I think are all wonderful to read today as well, right? Because we can, as a woman, I can forget that I need to be very affectionate to my husband. We can get on with the day. And so all of that is a challenge. And I think a great inspiration. I think her writing is, because of all the allegory, is really fun to read.
It's very engaging.
It's very engaging.
It's not dry at all.
That's right. For students, there's a lot of symbolism, of course, that you can weave out. I think it would be wonderful to see scholars, female scholars, male scholars, take up her work and do a lot of kind of these comparisons that we've been doing to more with the texts. Has
there been a revival of her at all? I know you're trying to lead a revival of her. Do you see it in other scholars or, I don't know, students or...
Yeah. So, there are those who teach her here and there. I think that it would be great if those who know the Western tradition and really love the Western tradition, so for instance, when I read sort of secondary commentary on her, you do, especially, there'll be questions like a chapter in a book, like, is Christine a feminist, and sort of comparing her to sort of modern feminism in these things. And I think to know sort of where, like, to understand the medieval frame in which she's speaking, to think about the ancients and know them. If you don't know all that, you miss so much that she has to teach us about that time and about that worldview. And I think people who have that kind of background it would be wonderful if they would be the ones who come to her, instead of it just being those who are sort of reading like feminist literary criticism, going and reading Christine, if that makes some sense. I mean, I would say that that's true with regard to a lot of these older female thinkers. Mary Estelle, I mean, there's all sorts that I am actually involved in collecting in an anthology right now, so that we can read their texts and see how much they have to teach us today about relations between men and women, about sort of this, what you see early on in and all of these female thinkers, I mean, before like 1910, I mean, there are strains you see in the 1800s that don't have this aspect, but most of them are really relying on the Imago Dei. They're calling both men and women to virtue. I mean, this is the tradition they're acting out of. And so for us to understand this tradition, I think would really be of great benefit to us today, both as a literary exercise in history, and exercise in learning, but also just for our own edification and our relationships.
And maybe one more very practical question, in trying to tie all this together. You've also written a lot about family policy, kind of the role the family should play in a conservative vision of politics. Are there any through lines from Christine de Pizan to your work in family policy, or are there ways in which it informs how you think about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that I've done quite a bit of work in sort of talking about how unique kind of post-industrial liberal living is in terms of the history of the world and in terms of how women have worked. And I think knowing kind of the medieval tradition, knowing the way in which men and women were working together in their own roles and in different ways according to their own talents and capacities and all of that, but the way in which the household was such a feature. I mean, I've called for like recentering the household, as have others, but I think the household and sort of the autonomy of the household and the way in which with technology, I mean, I always think that both technology, but then also people homeschooling and sort of, going off the grid. I mean, all sorts of different ways in which we could think about the household again as not so much, we're responding to the market's needs, but we're responding to the household's needs.
Sure.
And how is it that we as mothers and fathers, as husbands and wives, with shared responsibilities for our children can think about how we want to structure that, and I think she gives us a lot of further, like we can think back further than the 1950s or then kind of a separate spheres industrial tradition where men went out, women stayed in, and then women went out and children, was going to take care of them, So we have a problem of models, and she gives us lots of interesting models. I think the medieval period itself gives us interesting models because it's when a lot took place in the household, a lot took place in the towns.
Sure.
And so how can we sort of think about that vision again for family instead of sort of being stuck in an idea that, traditionalism or conservatism is just sort of this one
size fits all from a certain slice in time.
That's right.
It seems like that emphasis on wholeness and the common good and how all the parts are working together. And it's not just, divided, competing elements. It's sort of a beautiful model to think about the family and also politics today.
I think that's right.
Great. We'll close there. Thanks so much, Erika.
Thank you, Johnny.